Hello, people of grace. I'm back on my porch, known as Rev's Gym, and I come today with a challenge for our church of being virtuous. What does it mean to be virtuous? That's a question mark. You know, are we virtuous? Um, 2 Peter chapter 1 says that the first fruit, the first thing that we should try to add to our faith is virtue. Since that's the first thing that should be a product of the faith within us, a good question would be, what is virtue? It might be a little different than a lot of us think today. For the ancient Greeks, going all the way back to Homer and the Iliad and those times, virtue was most commonly used in the context of being courageous in battle, of enhancing or improving the common good, even at sacrifice to yourself. So it had that kind of very raw, very courageous in the face of physical danger, even willingness to enhance the common good, even at great risk to yourself. And it, kind of built on that meaning over the centuries between Homer and our New Testament. But that element is still there. And that is at the heart of what we might call goodness. Earlier in 2 Peter chapter 1, which I'll come to in a minute, we see that God has virtue or goodness within himself. And sticking with Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, we have this verse that is translated this way, declaring the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. But that little word praises is really this idea of virtue, declaring the virtues of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And that took great courage for Jesus to do that, a great willingness to put himself at risk for the common good, for the social component of his love, what we experience as being part of the church, his body. So virtue is courage in battle, a willingness to endure even physical risk, and to do it to enhance the common good. It's a summary of what our God is like. So that's a brief dive into virtue. So if the first fruit of our faith, the first thing we should add to our faith is virtue, and we now have some sense of what virtue is, how does Peter tell us to get virtue? What is the process? Well, for Peter, virtue comes by faith. But faith comes, if you back up in 2 Peter chapter 1, by God's divine power, and it comes through that power by our knowledge, our personal experience of God, which he grants to us by his glory and goodness, or virtue. That's all in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. So virtue comes through faith, but faith comes through God's divine power, through a deep personal experience or knowledge of him, which he makes available to us not because of anything in us, but by his own glory and goodness. And through that glory and goodness or virtue, God gives us great promises. By these promises, here's the mind-blowing phrase, we participate in the divine nature. There's some sense in which, as Adam's sin brought condemnation in all humanity, so Christ's act of righteousness brings potential justification for all humanity, because God became human, and through him, humans can now participate in the divine nature. And by participating in the divine nature, or by God making his divine nature commonly available and accessible to us through belief in Christ and the Spirit that comes through him, by that participation, that common sharing, that community experience of God's nature, we escape the corruption that is in the world through our own misplaced, misguided, fallen desires. This world will corrode us over time. God has made a way by which we can participate in His nature and gain His virtue. So as children of faith, in each situation, as the working out of your faith, as the growing of your faith, as the adding to your faith, add virtue. Be courageous. Take a moment to pause and see why you're analyzing things so frenetically. That's almost always related to anxiety and fear, or us trying to prove ourselves in some way. Take a deep breath. Name and face your fear. That's the beginning of virtue. Without courage, every facet of virtue quickly fails. So add to your faith courage, and you're well on the way to virtue. God has called us to actually participate in His own nature. There is no more encouraging promise than that. And, as I said last week, encouragement is encouraging. Be encouraged, be virtuous, and have a blessed day.